Welcome to week 6 of my series that helps international students adapt to university in China. Hi, my name is Dr. Mark, and I've been living and teaching in China for 9 years. Last week's episode focused on key concerns about what it's like to live in China. This week, I help deepen your understanding by introducing the lowest and highest points in China's history. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is the 100 years or century of humiliation, where China was colonized by a minimum of 8 countries: the United Kingdom, the US, Russia, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. I say a minimum of 8 because there's 6 more European countries who are also involved in that period, but they weren't as involved as those 8 I've just told you about. And so this started in 1842 and ended in 1949. And 1842 marked the end of the first Opium War that Britain had initiated because it basically was getting very low on silver because Britain wanted to buy so many things of what China made. So China, for instance, tea, silk, and yet China was not that interested in buying anything from Britain. And so Britain was paying out all this silver to China and just losing all its reserves. So it wanted to change that and get China to buy something from it. And so it forced China by trying to get it addicted to opium, believe it or not. This is opium that was grown in India. And so the whole idea was to get China addicted and create demand for opium, and then Britain would get payment for that opium, and it would help fill the coffers. So just utterly immoral, and I think so immoral, in fact, I've never even heard about any of the Opium Wars. I just talked about the end of the first Opium War, but there was a second one too. And so I never learned about any of this in Canada. I didn't hear about it in the news anywhere. Any of the Western media coverage of China, you hear nothing about the Opium Wars. And this is critical, like really the number one thing to understand about China, this 100 years of humiliation that was kicked off by the first Opium War. This is what marks China's way of looking at the world. And so if you don't talk about this, is what the Western media has done, just avoid it, and then you talk about the buildup of China's military, it makes China look like it's trying to take over the world. Well, no, it's just trying to defend itself. China wants to make sure that this century of humiliation never happens again. So it will do anything to prevent this period. This was the worst period in China's history. And so it was when it was really weak, and basically it was started off with Britain, but then these other countries got involved. And I mean, they colonized different parts of China, semi-colonized. There were concessions that went so far as letting nationals of those respective countries to live in that area and even follow the laws of their own country, not even Chinese laws. And so just unbelievable, rubbing China's face in the dirt, basically, over a 100-year period. So the end of that period was 1949, and that's when the Communist Party came to power. So this is why everyone is so thankful for the Communist Party, finally, and Mao finally making China strong enough to stand up to these foreign forces. So you can imagine China's way of looking at the world is all these foreign countries, as soon as we got weak, took advantage of us. And this builds on a long history of being raided multiple times by foreign civilizations like the Mongols, Genghis Khan, for instance. And so China has this view of foreigners that's rooted in a history that is not that positive. So this just reinforced it, that China cannot afford ever to be weak again. And so it needs to do whatever is required to prevent this from happening. So the buildup of the military is a defensive approach to make sure that it isn't taken over again, taken advantage of again. And so when you hear the whole story about the Opium Wars and basically Britain acting like a drug pusher, you totally understand China's mindset. It makes total sense. And you would do the same thing yourself. This is the conclusion that I came to after coming to China. And I especially discovered it, or was close to it, because the first city I lived in, Nanjing, that was the place, the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing that ended the First Opium War. And part of that Opium War, and this is another thing that is never talked about in the media, is Hong Kong. So this is when China had to give up Hong Kong to the British. And so, through the media, we've been led to believe that it's always been British or something, never been Chinese, and that it's terrible that China wants its territory back after Britain forced its hand into having to give up Hong Kong. And so it just paints, when you understand this history, this century of humiliation, it completely flips the narrative. And suddenly it all makes sense what China is doing. And it's not aggressive, it's defensive. It's taking responsibility for your life, basically, if it was a person. So that's what China is doing. So it had to give up Hong Kong. It was also forced into trading in opium, forced to open various ports. And I'm living in one of those cities that was forced open to the world to trade. China didn't want to trade. China just felt like we have everything we need. We're not that interested in trading with the outside world, but they were forced to. And I'm living in one of those communities, and you can see if I go down to the main tourist area here in Yantai, there's a lot of German architecture, and there's also old consulates right in this city. Of U.S. consulate is one that I've been to, and I think the U.K. one is here. So they're kind of tourist attractions now, but I knew nothing about this colonization of China in the past. This is just obliterated from the media, no mention of it. And even south of here, there's another city called Qingdao, and that was a German controlled area for quite a period. And there's there's a German church there, Protestant church, is very prominent, and the architecture, definitely very German architecture downtown. There's even Qingdao beer was founded by a German. So the big brewery in China originated with a German. And so there's all this history that the world does not understand. And so I've only talked about German and UK, but as I say, there's Russia and Japan and so on. So imagine 8 different countries are taking over your country, and their citizens of each of those countries has their own set of laws just relating to their own country and not Chinese law that they have to follow. And they even had different police forces and so on enforcing those foreign laws and those concessions. And so this is also the history of Shanghai. Basically, it was all these foreigners, the different foreign concessions within Shanghai. And so that's why it's a more international city. So this deeper understanding, this will really help you understand what's China's sensitivity around this topic. I mean, it's probably best just to stay away from discussing it, but if you hear anyone get really upset or lose their cool about this, you can understand why. So it's much deeper, And so, as a tip, I also think a couple tips to help you understand these things more deeply. So, this was the worst period in Chinese history, and I'll tell you the best period in Chinese history. So, to counterbalance that, and I figure if you know both of these, the best and the worst times, you'll get a good picture, a good snapshot of China that's not too complicated. So, the first thing I would say, if you want to understand this period of Century of Humiliation or 100 Years of Humiliation, search under those words. Search online for those words or search for a video. What I did, I actually read a book called The Rape of Nanking because I was moving to Nanjing, and Nanking used to be the old name for Nanjing. And it was all about a period when the Japanese invaded China in 1937. So basically, World War II for China started a few years earlier than it did in Europe. And you never hear about this part of World War II in the East. It's largely not on in the media, in the Western media. And so China was invaded by Japan in 1937, and Japan, one of its aims was to get to Nanjing, which I believe was the capital at that time. So there was a horrific 300,000 people were killed. And there's lots of rapes and untold things that happened, really terrible. And the really bad thing about this to this day is that Japan has never apologized. It's never fully acknowledged what it did. And there's no debate over whether this even happened. It definitely did. To such an extent, there's enough evidence that the leaders, the military leaders, Japanese military leaders at the time, they were all hung in there was an international tribunal and where they were tried and they were found guilty and they were hung. And but Japan has never acknowledged this as a country of its role in this. And obviously, it was the country that invaded. So, this is what really gets under some Chinese people's skins to this day. And I would say China is a really super peaceful nation and happy. People are generally really happy, I would say. But the only time, so the worst things that I ever heard about talk of another country was when I was living in Nanjing. So there were people that I met there that were still very angry about what Japan did during that period. So it's commemorated. There's a museum, Nanjing Massacre Museum, where you can see what happened. And it was horrific. I won't even get into all the details. I'll let you investigate that yourselves. But anyway, you can read a book by Iris Chang called The Rape of Nanking. And Iris Chang was a Chinese American, and even in her family, who were from Nanjing, it was a family secret. No one talked about it. And it was only until one day she heard her grandmother talking about this event that occurred in Nanjing that she first heard of it. And so she just basically asked her grandmother more information, and then she started investigating and discovered, yes, this was a real thing that happened. And so she's written this book now that you can learn about what happened in the Nanjing Massacre. And so this was part of that Century of Humiliation, 1937. So 12 years before the end of that period. It was probably the single most reprehensible event that occurred during that 100 years, but there's many humiliating things that happened. Anyway, so moving on to more positive things, I would say the high point in Chinese civilization was the Tang dynasty, and that lasted from 618 to 907. And so this was the high point in Chinese history because Chang'an, which was the capital of China at the time, was one end of the Silk Road. Basically, it's modern day Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are. So same place. But at that time was the high point. It was the largest city in the world, Chang'an, and it was the most cosmopolitan because it was at one end of the Silk Road. So you had people from all over the world. So that's when Tang China emerged as one of the greatest empires in the medieval world. There was merchants, clerics, and envoys from India, Persia, Arabia, Syria, Korea, and Japan who would throng the streets of Chang'an, the capital, and foreign tongues were a common part of everyday life, so foreign languages. And so I would suggest, if you want to learn more about that, again, do a search on the Tang dynasty. And I think this still lives today in the Chinese psyche because I do get a sense that there's kind of a respect for different cultures in China. I was surprised by that because otherwise it seems quite homogeneous. But this is another thing you learn after living in China for a while. On the surface, it looks quite homogeneous, and everyone's speaking Mandarin. But everyone's speaking Mandarin for a reason because there's so many different dialects and even different languages. They had to have a single language for the country to work in unison. And so you start learning about all these different dialects that still exist to this day. And of course, there's different types of food depending on the region you're in and so on. So there's a lot more diversity in China than you realize. And if you look at the history, China is a large area. And so it's just like, it's a continent and very large areas. So it used to be a whole bunch of different countries, dozens of different countries, just like Europe, only it unified over time. It didn't split up like Europe did. And so there's this diversity underneath. And coming from a very multicultural city, Toronto, I've detected almost everywhere I went, even rural areas, that there's this kind of real fascination for me, like am I from? These are always the first questions. People want to understand more. And so they're very curious about other cultures. And I thought, like, where does this come from? Because I thought I'd feel like an us and them kind of feel like, you're not Chinese and so on. But I've never really felt that. And yet, if I go to rural areas in Canada, I can definitely feel that. You're not from this town, you're from the city or something. So a real sort of us and them feeling I've had in Canada, remote parts of Canada. But I've never had it in China, even cycling to rural villages. People have always been really open and curious. And I've wondered about this, reflected on it, and I think it starts with the Tang dynasty because I think it's kind of part of the psyche of Chinese to want to be open to all cultures of the world and unify all cultures. And so I think that has been carried forward since the Tang dynasty. And so you hear there's actually a rock band called the Tang Dynasty. There's a famous poet called Li Bai from that period. So we're talking about 1400 years ago. And he's still a really popular poet amongst Chinese, young Chinese teenagers. And so that just blows your mind. You think a poet from 1400 years ago is still one of the most popular poets in Chinese history. It's amazing. So just that connection between the youth and the past. But this is China. This is what I've learned about China. So people can recite poetry from 1400 years ago. And so there was incredible diversity. And so there you have it, the worst period in Chinese history and the high point in Chinese history. Oh, and the other thing about the high point, I would say this is the dream of all Chinese people. After being here for a while, I've heard this a few times. People dream about returning to that day. So, again, to give you guidance, if you understand the Century of Humiliation, it will help you understand how China looks at the world and foreigners. And so that should really help you coming to China. And then the other thing with the Tang dynasty, that's kind of the vision for the future. If you're imagining where the world, where China's going to take us when it becomes, the unrivaled leader of the world, just imagine the Tang dynasty. That is the dream of Chinese people. And so with those two together, I think that can really help prepare you for the mental mindset of Chinese people when you come to China to do your degree. Okay, that's it for week 6, and we'll see you in week 7.